And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Hello, I'm meteorologist David Kramer with Alaska Weather. For today, we'll be talking about our marine forecast. Starting off with a look at our ice edge, we are seeing new ice growth all along the Arctic coast and down much of the west coast as well, some areas down in Norton Sound there. And then as we drop down to the southwest coastline, we do have areas around the Yukon and Kuskokwim deltas that are starting to see some new ice. And even down on the Bering side of the Alaska Peninsula, we're seeing some new ice growth. For the rest of our marine forecast, we'll first focus in on some of the weather. Up along the Arctic coast, one of the more impactful areas up there, we are seeing some stronger winds that are going to develop on Friday, bringing some blowing snow conditions to the area. We're going to see some high pressure along the west coast here. It's going to diminish some of the winds, but we're going to see some stronger winds around a low by the Aleutian Islands here on Friday. Then out over the Gulf of Alaska and into southeast, a lot weaker pattern here with some high pressure just to the south of the Gulf, but we do have a trough pushing through that could amplify some of the winds, especially in some of the channeled areas. Then on Saturday, pretty similar here, we are going to see some weaker winds out over much of the Gulf with high pressure starting to push in from the west. Still going to see some easterly flow from the low to the south of the Alaska Peninsula on Saturday, but then along the west coast, high pressure is still dominating. However, as we get up to the Arctic coastline, we're going to see continued stronger winds from this trough pushing through in that tighter pressure gradient that we have up along the northeast coastline. So taking a look now at the marine forecast for Friday in southeast, we're going to see southerly winds around 10 knots in the inside waters, and then out over the Gulf, westerly winds 10 to 15 knots, becoming southerly as we get closer towards Yakutat. Then on Saturday, picking up, especially in those inside waters areas, up to as high as 30 knots there out of a north to northwesterly direction, dropping down to 15 knots in the southern locations. Out over the Gulf, a more northerly flow, 15 to 20 knots is expected. Let's look out over south central Alaska on Friday. Out over the Gulf waters, primarily northerly winds 15 to 20 knots, 15 knots in Prince William Sound as well. Out over the Cook Inlet area, north to northeast winds 15 to 20 knots expected. Then on Saturday, pretty similar, Cook Inlet area, 15 to 20 knots out of a northerly direction, still primarily northerly winds in the Gulf of Alaska area. Western locations around 15 to 20 knots, getting up to size 25 knots in the far northern locations. In the Prince William Sound area, expecting to see 15 knots. For the Alaska Peninsula and Kodiak Island, starting around Kodiak Island, northeasterly winds 15 to 20 knots expected, up to 25 to 30 knots on the Bering side of the Alaska Peninsula out of a northeasterly direction. And then out of the similar direction on the Pacific side, 20 knots most locations, but picking up by the Cold Bay area around 35 knots. Then on Saturday, starting out by Kodiak Island, northerly winds 15 to 20 knots expected, and then all around the peninsula, northeast winds 20 to 25 knots, strongest on the Pacific side. For the Aleutian Islands, starting off in the eastern Aleutians, northeast winds 30 to 35 knots, becoming more northerly for the central Aleutians, around 25 knots there. Then out by the western Aleutian Islands, northerly winds 25 to 30 knots expected. For Saturday, switching up quite a bit, becoming southerly up to as high as 40 knots by the western Aleutian Islands, becoming more easterly or northeasterly as we move towards the central Aleutian Islands, around 25 knots there, and then picking up to 25 to 30 knots for the eastern Aleutians. Along the west coast, north to northeast winds in most locations, 15 knots north of Nunavik Island, getting up to 25 knots on the southern side of Nunavik Island. And then for the St. Matthew Island area, and easterly winds around 25 knots, picking up to 35 knots out of the northeast for the Pribilof Islands. Then on Saturday, northern locations by Norton Sound, a westerly component, 10 to 15 knots, becoming more easterly as we get by Nunavik Island, 10 to 15 knots, picking up to 25 knots as we get farther to the south. By St. Matthew Island, southerly winds up to as high as 30 knots there, and then 15 knots out of a northeasterly direction by the Pribilof Islands. Up along the Arctic coastline, we're going to see winds out of a westerly direction, 30 to 35 knots, strongest as we get farther to the east. And then down the west coast, northwesterly winds, 20 to 25 knots are expected. On Saturday, still seeing stronger winds along the Arctic coastline, strongest again as we get farther to the east by Kaktovik. 45 knots is the highest there, with seas up to as high as 12 feet. Then along much of the west coast, we're going to see southwesterly winds, 15 to 20 knots, getting highest through the Bering Strait area. With Alaska Weather, I'm David Kramer. Thanks for watching.